woke because something was crackling. Not leaves, not branches. Fire. I unzipped my tent just enough to look outside. The campfire was burning. Not glowing, burning. Fresh cedar logs were stacked into a perfect teepee, flames climbing high enough to light the trees around my campsite. I had drowned that fire before bed. I remembered stirring the ashes until they turned into gray mud. Someone had rebuilt it while I slept. That should have been enough to make me leave. It wasn't. 3 days later, I found a photograph of myself asleep inside that same tent. That's when I realized the campfire had never been the real reason someone kept coming back. It started 4 days earlier when I drove into Gifford Pinchot National Forest, looking for one quiet weekend where nobody could reach me. I picked a dispersed campsite almost 5 miles from the nearest paved road. No campground, no neighboring tents, just a small clearing beside a narrow creek hidden beneath thick pine trees. On the way in, I stopped at a ranger station for directions. The ranger, an older man named Collins, circled my route on a map. "You'll lose phone service after the old bridge," he said. I figured. He handed the map back, then hesitated. "If something in those woods starts helping you..." He paused, just long enough for me to look back at him. "Leave." I laughed. "What does that even mean?" He shrugged. "Most people ignore their instincts." 15 minutes later, my phone lost service. No bars, no GPS, nothing. The campsite was perfect. A quiet creek, thick pines, nothing but silence. I spent the afternoon hiking nearby, gathered fallen pine branches for firewood, cooked dinner, then drowned the fire before crawling into my tent. Water, dirt, more water. I stirred the ashes until they became gray sludge. Then I went to sleep, until that crackling woke me. I stood outside my tent staring at the flames. Whoever rebuilt the fire hadn't rushed. The logs were stacked neatly. Not a single ember had escaped the fire ring. I searched the clearing with my flashlight. Nothing. No voices, no movement, no fresh footprints. The only thing that didn't belong was a neat stack of split cedar beside the fire pit. I hadn't collected cedar. Every piece of wood I'd gathered had been pine. Someone had carried those logs into my campsite. I threw every one of them into the woods before making breakfast. For the rest of the day, I kept trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe another camper had wandered into the wrong clearing. Maybe someone thought they were helping. Neither explanation made much sense, but they were better than admitting someone had stood a few feet from my tent while I slept. That evening, I cooked chili in a small metal pot. When I finished eating, I rinsed it in the creek and left it beside a rock. Before bed, I checked the fire 3 different times. Cold. Dead. Impossible to relight on its own. Sometime after midnight, one short whistle. Close enough that I stopped breathing. I waited. Nothing. After several minutes, the forest became quiet again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The smell of smoke woke me before sunrise. I already knew what I was going to see. The fire was burning. Again. The cedar logs were back. Only this time, my cooking pot wasn't beside the rock. It was hanging neatly from a low branch. Spotless. Every bit of soot had been scrubbed away. I hadn't packed soap. I hadn't even packed a towel. Someone else had cleaned it. I stood there holding the pot, suddenly aware that this wasn't just someone passing through. They weren't stealing from me. They weren't trying to scare me. They were taking care of my campsite. And somehow, that felt worse. I should have packed my truck right then. Instead, I stayed. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Before sunset, I photographed the entire campsite with my phone. My tent, my chair, my backpack, the cooler, the fire ring. If anything moved during the night, I'd notice. Then I scattered dry pine needles and brittle twigs around the fire pit and around the entrance to my tent. Not enough to look obvious, just enough that anyone walking through would leave a trail. I skipped the campfire completely that night. I ate a cold sandwich, zipped the tent shut, and lay awake with a flashlight in one hand. Around midnight, the whistle came again. One short note, closer than before. I held my breath. Thump. Something heavy landed outside. I froze. Another second passed. Silence. I threw open the tent flap and swept the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Then the beam settled on the fire ring. A fresh, split cedar log lay perfectly in the center. It hadn't been there seconds earlier. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight through the trees. Nobody. I walked straight to the pine needles and twigs. Nothing had moved. No broken twigs, no disturbed needles, no sign that anyone had crossed into the clearing. At least, not in any way I could understand. I backed toward my tent, suddenly aware that whoever kept entering my campsite wasn't just hiding from me. They were staying one step ahead of me. I never went back to sleep. Around 1 a.m, a whistle. One short note. From somewhere to my left. I stood perfectly still. 5 seconds later, another whistle answered. This time from my right. Far enough apart that one person couldn't have moved between them that quickly. Maybe it was an echo. I listened. The creek flowed quietly behind me. There were no cliffs, no rock walls, nothing that should have echoed a sound like that. The forest fell silent again. At first light, I checked the campsite. The fire was burning. Again. The pine needles around my tent hadn't moved. The twigs around the fire pit were exactly where I'd left them. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It looked as though nobody had entered the campsite, but someone had. My folding chair had been moved. Yesterday it faced the creek. Now it faced my tent, as if someone had spent the night sitting there, watching. I looked toward my backpack. It was standing neatly against a tree. I'd left it lying beside my tent. Slowly, I opened it. Everything was still there, but it wasn't packed the way I'd packed it. My clothes had been folded. My first aid kit sat neatly on top. My map had been tucked into the front pocket instead of hanging halfway out where I'd left it. Whoever had done this had gone through every single thing I owned, then carefully put it all back. I didn't know which was worse, if something had been missing, or the fact that everything was still there. By noon, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I hiked until one bar of signal appeared and quickly texted my brother. Someone keeps coming into my campsite. Before the message could send, no service. Again. I should have kept walking to my truck. Instead, I turned around. That decision changed everything. The next day, after what happened that night, I drove to the ranger station. I couldn't stop thinking about the trail camera. 43 minutes. Whoever had stood in front of it hadn't moved once. They hadn't searched my campsite. They hadn't paced. They had simply stood there, watching. I drove straight back to the ranger station with the memory card still in my pocket. Collins watched the footage without saying a word. When the screen finally went black, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. I was hoping you'd never see that. You've seen this before? Not that recording. He looked at the blank monitor. But I've heard that story. He unlocked the filing cabinet and pulled out a faded incident folder. Most of the papers were handwritten. Different names, different years, the same complaints. Fire rebuilt, gear moved, nothing stolen. I flipped through them until one page caught my attention. It wasn't a report, it was a transcript. What's this? Collins stared at it for a moment. The last phone call we ever got from the missing camper. I looked up. He called you? He made it as far as the old bridge, had just enough signal. What did he say? Collins didn't answer immediately. Then he quietly read from the page. I think someone's been in my campsite every night. A pause. They keep helping me. Another pause. I don't think they want me to leave. The transcript ended there. What happened? The call dropped. You called him back? He never answered. I swallowed hard. Did anyone find him? Collins slowly shook his head. We found his truck. That was all he said. Before I left, he handed me an old laminated map. There's another campsite half a mile east of yours. I thought you said it was closed. It is. Why are you showing me? Because if you're going to ignore my advice, he sighed, I'd rather you know where the others stayed. The old campsite was almost invisible beneath weeds and young pine trees. The fire ring was cracked. A rusted cooking grate leaned against a fallen log. Pieces of faded tarp were tangled in blackberry bushes. Nothing looked disturbed, until I found a weatherproof notebook tucked beneath a flat stone. The first entries were ordinary. Fishing, weather, hiking. Then everything changed. Day 2. Someone rebuilt my fire. A few pages later, my dishes were clean this morning. Then, boots lined up outside the tent. Another page. Stayed awake all night. Never saw anyone. Then one entry stopped me cold. Woke up with my sleeping bag zipped all the way to my chin. I know I didn't do that. The handwriting became shaky after that. The final page contained only one sentence. If they start helping you, don't let them finish. There were no more entries, no explanation, no goodbye. I shoved the notebook into my backpack and hurried back to my truck. I wasn't trying to solve the mystery anymore. I just wanted proof. On the drive into town, I bought 2 trail cameras and a roll of bright orange survey tape. By late afternoon, I was back at my campsite. One camera overlooked the fire ring. The other faced my tent. Then I stretched strips of orange tape between trees around the clearing. Not enough to block anyone, just enough that they'd have to disturb it. I even took photos before climbing into the tent. If a single strip moved, I'd know. That night I refused to sleep. I sat against my backpack with the flashlight resting across my lap. The hours crawled by. No whistle, no footsteps, nothing. Thump. Something heavy landed outside. I froze. Another second passed. Silence. I threw open the tent flap and swept the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Then the beam settled on the fire ring. A fresh split cedar log lay perfectly in the center. It hadn't been there seconds earlier. I turned slowly sweeping the flashlight through the trees. Nobody. I walked straight to the orange tape. I grabbed one strip and pulled it tight. It hadn't stretched. It hadn't snapped. Nobody had crawled underneath it. At least, not in any way I could understand. I backed toward my tent, suddenly aware that whoever kept entering my campsite wasn't just hiding from me. They were staying one step ahead of me. I never went back to sleep. Around 1 a.m, a whistle. One short note from somewhere to my left. I stood perfectly still. 5 seconds later, another whistle answered, this time from my right. The forest fell silent again. At first light, I checked the cameras. The one facing my tent was gone. The nylon strap had been cut clean through. The other camera was still attached exactly where I'd left it. My hands were shaking as I removed the memory card. Hours of darkness. Trees swaying in the wind. Nothing. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the screen turned black. Not because the recording stopped. Something had stepped so close to the lens that it blocked the entire view. The timestamp kept counting. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 12. 26. 43. I found myself holding my breath. Then, the darkness moved. Slowly. The campsite came back into view. The fire ring, my tent, the orange tape. Everything looked exactly the same. Nothing had been disturbed. Whoever had stood in front of that camera for 43 minutes had stepped away and disappeared without leaving a single trace. That's when I finally understood what terrified me most. I wasn't trying to figure out who kept visiting my campsite anymore. I was trying to figure out how someone could get close enough to touch my life without ever letting me see them. I sat in my truck for nearly 10 minutes with the trail camera balanced on the steering wheel. The engine was running. The road back to the highway was wide open. I could have left. Instead, I looked toward the trees one last time. Nothing moved. Nothing watched back. At least, nothing I could see. I drove straight to my campsite, not because I wanted answers anymore, because every piece of my gear was still there. I wasn't about to leave hundreds of dollars worth of equipment behind. I told myself I'd be in and out in 10 minutes, throw everything in the truck, drive away, never come back. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it. The orange survey tape still hung between the trees. The remaining trail camera was gone. Not knocked down, not damaged. Gone. Only the cut strap was still wrapped around the trunk. I didn't bother looking for it. I folded my tent without shaking the dirt off. I shoved sleeping bags, cooking gear, clothes, and food into the truck without organizing anything. For the first time that weekend, I didn't care if something got broken. I just wanted to leave. Then I noticed the fire ring. Fresh cedar, stacked neatly. Enough wood to keep a fire burning until morning. No flames, just the wood, waiting. I remembered the last sentence in the notebook. If they start helping you, don't let them finish. I didn't touch the logs. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and started backing toward the narrow forest road. As I reached the end of the clearing, something caught my eye in the side mirror. A white square tucked beneath my windshield wiper. It hadn't been there a second earlier. My stomach tightened. I stared at it through the glass. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I looked in every mirror. The road behind me was empty. The trees were still. After nearly a minute, I opened the door just enough to grab it. It was an instant photograph, the kind that develops on thick white film. The image had already finished developing. It showed my tent from only a few feet away. The zipper was half open. Inside, I could see myself asleep in my sleeping bag. The picture had been taken from inside my campsite, close enough that the photographer could have reached out and touched the tent. My hands started shaking. I turned the photograph over. Nothing. No writing, no date. Just a blank white back. I threw it onto the passenger seat, slammed the truck into drive, and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the old bridge. The moment my phone connected to the network, it exploded with notifications. Missed messages, voicemails, texts. One message from my brother had been sent almost 20 minutes earlier. Call me. I called him immediately. He answered before the first ring finished. Where are you? I'm leaving the forest. Then he asked, who was standing behind your truck? Every muscle in my body locked. What? You sent me a picture earlier. My heart sank. The one that finally came through. I remembered the selfie I'd tried sending when I found one bar of service. It only showed you for a second, he continued, but there was somebody behind your truck. I couldn't speak. I figured you were camping with someone. I wasn't. Another silence. You sure? Positive. He texted me the photo while we were still on the phone. I pulled onto the shoulder before opening it. There I was, standing beside the trail, holding my phone toward my face. Behind my truck, partially hidden by a pine tree, someone stood watching me. Too far away to make out a face, dark clothes, hands at their sides. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at me. The timestamp showed the picture had been taken 2 days earlier. I had never noticed anyone. The sheriff's office searched the campsite the following morning. They found tire tracks. Mine. Old boot prints that couldn't be dated. Nothing else. No fingerprints. No missing camera. No notebook. When I took them back to the abandoned campsite, the weatherproof notebook was gone. Only the flat stone remained. The deputy asked if I was sure I'd found it there. I was. Nobody believed me. Eventually, I stopped talking about it. Months passed. Life became normal again. Or at least, it looked normal. I moved to a different apartment, changed jobs, stopped camping altogether. Then one afternoon, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside was another instant photograph. This one showed my apartment building, taken from across the street. I was unlocking my front door. The photograph couldn't have been more than a few days old. On the back, in small, careful handwriting, were 5 words. Thanks for the firewood. I stared at the picture until the letters blurred. Then I locked every door in my apartment, closed every window, pulled every curtain. I told myself whoever had done this wanted me to panic. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Late that night, I was standing in my kitchen, trying to convince myself it was finally over. Then, from somewhere out in the parking lot, one short whistle. The exact same whistle I'd heard every night in the forest. I never looked outside.